So moving on to our colleagues from Monash, Dr. Kate Fitz-Gibbon, and Associate Professor Silke Meyer. It's going to be great to hear about the work from the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. Kate is a Senior Lecturer in Criminology and an Honorary Research Fellow in the School of Law and Social Justice at University of Liverpool. Silke is an Associate Professor in Criminology with a background in social work. Kate and Silke will present in the complex needs and experiences of young people who use family violence in the home, discussing the need for holistic and trauma-informed responses. So great to hear from you.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Kate and I will be co-presenting, so I will have a brief 10-minute introduction focusing on mothers' reflections of children's exposure to parental family violence before I hand over to Kate, and Kate will be talking about mothers' experiences of adolescent family violence and the barriers around help seeking and the support needs of mothers affected by family violence. Let's see. Okay, so I'll start, as I said, with a childhood exposure and mothers' reflections on how they then experience their children to become aggressive in the home as they turned older. So I think I'll just give a brief overview of this because I think a lot of it has been covered I guess by the introduction and by Elena's presentation. But I think, we've got great evidence around children's exposure, and I say exposure because it is really children's victimization where children grow up with adult family violence in the home. We know we've got extensive research evidence that highlights that even if children are never directly targeted by the perpetrating parent, that they witness much more than parents think they do, and that they are much more affected and really for that reason are equally primary victims of adult family violence as is the adult primary victim. We also know that for a long time, and we've seen some great changes slowly emerging around the mother blaming and the issue or the emerging focus on mothers and children as a unit rather than child protection services focusing solely on children's safety and DV services or family violence services solely focusing on mothers affected by family violence. But I think the accusations of failure to protect by mothers affected by intimate partner violence still play greatly into how mothers frame their experiences and how they then do or don't seek help once they experience adolescent family violence in addition to their previous or ongoing experiences of intimate partner violence. I think as Elena and Kathy have highlighted, obviously not all children growing up with adolescent family violence turn into perpetrators or young people using violence in the home. And equally, not all adolescents using family violence in the home have a history of childhood trauma. Having said that, I think as Elena has highlighted, the evidence around adolescent family violence is emerging very clearly that we have a large proportion of children that get picked up and labeled as adolescent family violence perpetrators that have substantial childhood trauma. And we know from the overwhelming literature that we've had for decades now around adult men using family violence that we have a substantial proportion of adult family violence perpetrators with substantial childhood trauma. So it's not surprising that we see the same proportion of childhood trauma in the younger people emerging essentially without intervention, turning into then young and older adult perpetrators in their own intimate relationships. So I just want to share some reflections of mothers because I think they very strongly highlight and nicely flow on from Elena's presentation that really when we respond to adolescent family violence, we're responding a decade too late. So these are women that all had contact with a variety of support services, primarily police, child protection, to some extent court, in their help-seeking process for their own experiences of intimate partner violence. And in their reflections on when I asked them around their help-seeking, the role children played in help-seeking, but also the impact they observed on their children, they reflected, A, on just how much of a role children played, how involved they were, how much they witnessed, even if they were never a direct target of the father's physical or verbal abuse. The impact mothers saw as children got older in terms of children's behavior then escalating in the home towards other siblings in the home, as well as towards mum. So I think, in this case, this is an example of, and I think the other thing, and Kate will talk more about that, it's become incredibly tricky for mothers to make sense of this experience of dual victimization, initially of intimate partner violence and then adolescent family violence in the home, because there's a great level of shame, guilt, that's come from ongoing mother blaming and these women having heard too many times that they didn't protect their children adequately. Why didn't she leave? Why did she let her children grow up with that kind of violence in the home, that by the time they then see their children emerging as perpetrators, that they're very reluctant to seek formal support because they don't want their children labeled and stigmatized, and because they hold a great level of shame and guilt associated with having had children growing up exposed to family violence. So this is another example where mum talks about her son who then became increasingly abusive towards his siblings. And this is a mum that, for example, said the children were never physically harmed by her abusive partner, but they were frightened, they're ongoingly frightened, and it had detrimental impacts on their well-being long-term, even after women separated from the abusive partner. And another mum who was talking about their children and who described her children as really having seen way too much beyond their capacity to cope and their level of maturity. Some of the women very clearly illustrated that fathers strategically use, and this is not uncommon, I don't know how many times I've heard this interviewing mothers affected by family violence, that the perpetrator in the home will strategically use and utilize the children to harm mum, force children to engage in verbal abuse towards mum, force children to engage in physical abuse towards mum, because children are scared, frightened of the perpetrator and will just do whatever it takes to keep themselves safe as much as they feel a loyalty with their primary adult victim. And another example of one mum that was saying that while the children weren't necessarily directly targeted, they witnessed a lot, and she's seeing increasingly her son being increasingly abusive, but again, having a level of understanding of what do I do with that when I know that this is his background and this is where it's all come from, and how do I now handle this? So I think a lot, like I liked Elena's positive outlook of, there's things we can do. I think one of the key messages that I've taken away from the mother interviews, but also from some more recent work that I've done on child protection interventions around abusive fathers, and aligning with mums and treating mums and children as a unit of need for support and protection and trauma recovery, is that I think we're moving towards more of an approach that is understanding mothers and children both as victims. I think we're still a long way off from, we've come to understand and acknowledge in our service responses that we need to respond to children exposed to family violence as victims, that exposure to family violence is a form of child abuse. We see that in our child protection responses to some extent. We see that in our police responses to some extent. But I think we're still missing the link that Elena has highlighted in her presentation it then gets very silent and invisible around children. We respond to parents. We assume that by responding to parents, by supporting mum, or by arresting the perpetrator, or by separating the family, or by removing the children, we've by default addressed the needs of children for safety, but we haven't taken the next step to assist children in their long-term trauma recovery needs. So I think some of the evidence around childhood exposure and the link that we see increasingly emerge in adolescent family violence focused research of that intersection of childhood trauma and adolescent aggression in the home is that we have a lost opportunity if we don't respond in the early stages when the children are young, when mothers seek help, and when we know children grow up with family violence. We've got a lost opportunity if we don't focus on child-centered trauma recovery needs and a joint approach to mothers and children in terms of support and protection. I'll hand over to Kate.
Very much, Silke. And I'd just like to echo my thanks as well to Family Safety Victoria and the Centre for putting this together and giving us the opportunity to be part of this. I have my phone here with the time because I know Kathy has warned me she will be ruthless. I am conscious that there's quite a few people in the audience who have heard me present the findings of this research, but it is an important opportunity today to come together and to reflect. And one of the things that we feel particularly proud of with the Victorian study that we did was being able to bring to the fore the experiences predominantly of mothers, but also of siblings, and a very small number of fathers that experience adolescent family violence. So I'm going to take the opportunity to do that today. Our study of adolescent family violence in Victoria was completed in 2018, and it had two main phases to it. The first phase was focus groups and interviews with practitioners and some expert advisors, speaking to them about what were the needs and what were the gaps in terms of service responses to adolescent family violence. There were a lot of gaps and a lot of needs, some pockets of best practice, and just a huge amount of insights from many of the people in this room about the ways in which practitioners were cobbling together responses and supports for families that they were coming into contact with that were experiencing adolescent family violence. Our second component of our study, which I'm going to focus on in the majority today, was an online anonymous survey with 120 people who had experienced adolescent family violence in Australia. And the reason that we did a survey was at the start we thought, well, how can we speak to people who are experiencing this to find out what is adolescent family violence for them? What does it look like? What's the experience? What's the impact? And where do they go for help? And what's the impact of that help seeking? And in the absence of many dedicated services, it's quite hard to access people. So we put out an online survey. We really weren't sure what type of traction it would get. It was, you know, from a researcher's perspective, incredibly encouraging how much data we received from it. From an individual kind of human perspective, it was heartbreaking that we had people who just wrote their life stories as if no one had ever listened to it before, and thankfully somebody wanted to hear it. And someone who's been doing family violence research for a little while now, it was the first time that after launching the report in 2018, I had a number of victims contacting me to say, not to say, thank you, this is going to help me, because our report was, quite dismal if you were someone experiencing this. Essentially, we were documenting how profound the impacts were and how limited the responses are currently. People saying, thank God I'm not the only one. It was really comforting for me to read other mothers' experiences and to know it's not just about me being a bad mum. Other mothers are going through this too. I'm not alone anymore. And so that kind of had a really profound impact on us. So to start with mothers, and then I will focus more on young people, kind of in line with today's focus. We predominantly heard from 81 mothers in our study, and we were really kind of struck by the fact that mothers occupied two spaces. They were responsible for the young person, but they were also at risk. And for us, it was this really tricky tension about how do you honour their victimisation and make sure we don't forget that they are victims of a form of family violence, but at the same time we don't want the young person to occupy the perpetrator space. So that felt like a really difficult balance that we were trying to strike while we were doing that. But the mothers were victims of family violence, incredibly severe family violence in some cases, but they were also the mother of the child who used violence in the home. And in the majority of cases, it was that second capacity that they spoke most about. They spoke about the responsibility to take care of their own safety, but the safety of others in the home, and the responsibility to try and minimise the impact that using family violence would have on the young person that was victimising them. They were far more active in their reflections of seeking help for their young person than they were in terms of seeking help for themselves. Very few mothers spoke about seeking help for themselves as victims. The majority spoke about trying to find services that could work with the young person to try and minimise their use of violence. And then in the majority of cases for the mothers that responded to our study, they weren't able to seek help that was adequate or effective in managing the family violence that they had or in minimising the family violence that they were experiencing. So we had a number that spoke about the ways in which they managed that risk and that use of violence in the home. A number of mothers who spoke about retreating from employment, paid employment so they could be at home all the time. A lot of people who spoke about family and social isolation. We had a number who said they no longer invited people over to the home anymore because there was too much property damage, or it was hard to predict what mood the young person would be in. So they were isolating in those ways as well. So I'll just focus on a couple of the key questions about what the reflections from mothers experiencing adolescent family violence told us and gave us insights in terms of who some of these young people were. One of the things that we were interested in is gender, and I think genders can often be quite a tricky question in this scenario, that there's quite a lot of people who for some time have disregarded the importance of gender in this space, but I think there's an increasing recognition that it is important. And we certainly found that in the reflections of the types of violence that we used, that it was extremely gendered, that girls were more commonly cited as using verbal violence and property damage as mechanisms for control, as ways to gain control or to achieve control within the home. Whereas when mothers were speaking of the violence used by male adolescents, it was more commonly physical violence. And these really held true across victimisation that siblings reflected on as well. And probably the stark difference that we saw in terms of sibling abuse was the emergence of quite sexualised verbal behaviour or property damage. So we had a number of siblings that spoke about kind of the sexual verbal abuse, name calling that happened in terms of sibling adolescent family violence, and also in terms of things like we had a number of siblings spoke about property damage, like one brother who cut all the insides out of his sister's underwear, who threw out all their sanitary items. So quite different modes of abuse within the home that went on, perpetrated by young males against female siblings. Just put a warning there that we do have some quite detailed quotes from mothers that were experiencing adolescent family violence. So just to give you a bit of a sense of some of the descriptions that we were given of types of adolescent family violence. And from a mother. One of the phrases that came across multiple mothers' descriptions of adolescent family violence was walking on eggshells, and that being in the home on a day-to-day basis operated in that way. And one mother described it as like living in a war zone. In terms of age, we learnt from both the focus groups and from the surveys that, as many people in this room would know, adolescent family violence definitely doesn't discriminate. We had descriptions of children as young as 6 years old using violence in the home, and then moving up to 18 and up to 25, and certainly the research is quite varied in terms of what it captures in that space. From service providers, we really empathised with the challenge that this presents in terms of working with young people, and a number of service providers we spoke to really found that there was a difficulty in terms of 8 to 12-year-olds of not being funded or not being prescribed or skilled to work with that young age group, but that they found a lot of young people presenting in that space. We also found, which would be unsurprising, that the uses of violence and types of violence changed according to age, with young people quite often using verbal abuse, coercive and controlling tactics, and then it's starting to move into physical violence with the growth of the adolescent. And that really, for young males in particular, peaking around that 15 to 16 age, where often physically they start to dominate over their mother. One of the one of the things that really struck us in terms of help seeking was a number of mothers and also practitioners said to us, with that early 10 to 12, and it really reminds me of what both Silke and Eleanor have said in terms of early intervention, at 10 to 12 or even 10 to 14, the young person still has buy-in into the family environment. Often by 15, 16, they want to be out the door. They no longer really care about the relationship with mum and dad if it has become so fractured. So a lot of people really spoke to us about wanting to get that support at 10 to 14 before it got too tricky, while the young person still wants to be part of the family or still feels that being part of the family is a necessary thing. Probably the other main thing to mention around age and around the types of adolescent family violence was the difficulty, though, in that first phase. And Silke briefly alluded to this, that we had a number of mothers that said, well, looking back now, I know that that early behaviour wasn't okay and that we were building to a form of family violence. But when does it become family violence? Or when is it just really tricky teenage behaviour? And, we certainly know, I think it's, in the definition of being a teenager, being an adolescent, that you're meant to test the boundaries. You're trying to find your independence. So for a lot of mothers, they found it really hard to know when that became something more problematic or something that you should be trying to seek help from. And often it meant that it had to get to that really obvious phase where there were safety concerns and immediate safety concerns before they knew that this was something that they should look for external support. And this really feeds in with what Eleanor's already said, but something that just came out so strongly across the mothers that we heard from was the complex needs of young people who use adolescent family violence and the incredible challenges that this posed for the mothers who were looking after children. We had a really high number of mothers who were supporting children with autism and with Asperger's, and a range of other disabilities as well. And what they really reflected on were some challenges around when they went to disability services, of the disability service saying, well, we're not a family violence service, fix the violence and then come back to us and we'll give you the support for the disabilities. And then when they went to family violence services, they either didn't have services for young people, or they said, we're not equipped to work with children who have disabilities. Go to the disability services, get that under control, get a plan for that, and then come back to us and we'll help you with the family violence. They really felt that there was no services available that coordinated and that worked across the complex needs of the children that they had in their care. And this was just one example from a mother in our survey. And I think this family, it raises, really, I think, unresolved and interesting questions around where the responsibility for this lies, but also really shows the need for coordinated and multi-system responses. There's no one expert, there's no one practitioner that can respond to the vast range of needs that exist in this space. Silke's already covered this in quite some detail, so I will not, but we certainly found in our study as well, mothers described experiences of intergenerational violence, and really the biggest thing that came forward there was the extra barrier that this provided in terms of them wanting to seek help because they felt so much responsibility for what the young person was doing and how that was playing out in their space, both in cases where the abusive adult was still in the family, but also we had another of mothers that reflected on when that abusive adult left, that the oldest male son would step into the position, and that was how they understood the head male in the household acts, and the incredible shame and responsibility that mothers held for that behaviour. So we're incredibly grateful for the people that spoke to us and participated in our research, and thank you very much.
Kate and Silke, thank you so much, and just bringing that extra dimension into this work for us to sort of be thinking about and engaging with. So yeah, thank you very much. I think that I love that work on thinking through this complex space of intergenerational violence without saying that it's predictive. So I think that that was beautifully done, so thank you.